Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started. We do have coffee and tea and water in the corner, but our food is not here yet. So if you do need to jump out a little bit later, once that does arrive, I'm sure that we'll all understand. My name is Hannah Christensen. I work for the NATO Field School here at Simon Fraser University, and we're really happy to be hosting this year's CDSN Capstone event. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I think everyone has our agenda already, so I was thinking we might just briefly introduce the people who aren't actually on our agenda, who are our esteemed professors in the panel in front of us here. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to introduce yourselves before we get started with our first panel today. And Sherry, is there anything I'm forgetting? Bathrooms are down the hall towards the elevator bank. And other than that, yeah, please, Rosalind, take it away.
Hi, I'm Rosalind Warner. I'm at Okanagan College and I teach political science there. I'm a PhD York. But SFU is actually my alma mater. I got my BA here. So I have a long-standing interest in international relations, Canadian foreign policy. I've edited 2 books on ethics and security in Canadian foreign policy. I also have interest in environmental issues and, of course, human security writ large, including development and climate issues. Hi, glad to see everybody.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Will Greaves. I'm an associate professor in the science department at the University of Victoria. My major areas of research at the moment are Arctic geopolitics and climate change and security, which have a very healthy overlap in the middle, but they're still 2 separate areas. I am the CDSN co-director for climate change in NATO. And I also have leadership roles related to climate change and security with 2 other federally funded aligned research networks. I won't name them for purposes of but I do a lot of work in climate change and security and try to do a lot of work with graduate students when I can. So it's a pleasure to be here and nice to see you.
Good morning, my name is Ken Christie. I'm the director of the School of Humanitarian Studies at Royal Roads University. I'm also the program head for the master's degree in human security and peace building. I'm also the president of the Confederation of University Faculty Associations of BC at the moment, which is 5,500 members. So I'm pretty tired. But very happy to be here. A lot of my research focuses on human rights and human security. I just published a new co-authored book on radicalization and terrorism with Roman and Littlefield. And another book, which actually had 2 books come out in 2 weeks of each other, which was not very great in terms of strategy. But the other book is on the relationship between Canada and China from a human security perspective. We're trying to Rob Hanlon, who you may know, he was here last year. I believe he was my co-author, and we're looking at a sort of theory of human security diplomacy and trying to develop that in terms of foreign policy relationships. So that's about it for now. Thanks.
Great timing.
Just on time.
Yeah.
Very sorry for the delay. My name is Vivian Jha. I am a research technician at the Outer Space Institute at the University of British Columbia. And my research will be focused mostly on space security and the dynamics between the US and China, which means a strategic competition in outer space. My background previously was more on nuclear disarmament as well as arms control. So I just started the role a few weeks ago. Very excited to hear everyone's presentation. It's really good conference.
Morning, everyone. My name is Paul Meyer. I'm adjunct professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University. I teach a seminar on inside diplomacy, a practitioner's perspective. As the title suggests, in the previous life, I was the career committee My interests broadly national security, maybe diplomacy, nuclear non-proliferation disarmament, outer space security, and international cyber security.
Excellent. So, I mean, one other person, of course, that we'll have with us later today is the director of the Field School, my boss, Dr. Maul-Wilson. So, I'm sure that kind of counts as a quick introduction for both of us and what we do. And we're the one who brought our banner, so you can hear more about our program. The other program I wanted to highlight quickly from the CDSN side of things is the Summer Institute. Which I highly recommend, especially to the two panels that we'll be hearing from today. I'm just speaking to it more and from a testimonial perspective because I did it 2 years ago, and Will is not along as someone who's participated on the other side of it before as well. It's an excellent program and really kind of like the Capstone event, a great opportunity to bring together voices from across Canadian defense and security. So it's really something that I'd recommend all of you to look into if you'd want to spend a week in Ottawa. Without further ado, we'll get into our first panel and our first presenter. So if you wanted to come up, Dr. Madison Schramm, please.
Good morning. I just wanted to thank CDSN and Hannah and Sherry and Rachel for all their work putting together such a wonderful event. I'm Madison Schramm. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and my research focuses broadly on international security and decision-making. And today, I'm going to be talking about a piece of a larger book project. So if I start to get close to the time limit, please don't hesitate to flag me down. So over the past 75 years, foreign policy in democracies in North America and Western Europe has really been dominated by these threats from charismatic authoritarian leaders. We can think of Mao, Pol Pot, Stalin, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, just to name a few. So what is it about these leaders that makes them so threatening? And the threat from them seems so all-consuming. Well, actually, in the past 75 years, most conflicts between democracies and autocracies have been fought between liberal democracies and personalist regimes. And in personalist regimes, this is a type of authoritarian state where the leader enjoys undisputed power and influence. And a long tradition dating back to ancient Greece and contemporary international relations theory would claim that these regimes are inherently more dangerous because they lack the same institutional constraints. But this can account for why democracies are actually disproportionately the initiators of these conflicts. So I'm going to argue that it's not actually just about them, it's about us. And that a psychological process inflected by cognitive biases, emotion, and social identity predispose leaders in liberal democracies to perceive these authoritarian dictators as acute threats. In particular, cognitive biases like the vividness effect and attribution predispose us to perceive information that seems more tangible, more heavily. Secondly, liberal democratic social identity has really been defined, especially since the end of the Second World War, in opposition to dictators. And lastly, the sort of connective tissue, which I argue is often missing in our theories of international relation, is emotion, because this is actually connected to somatic response. So what connects the threat to actual action? So I argue that rather than purely negative affect, this is anger, which is associated with more risk acceptant behavior and aggression. So my theory draws together themes from political psychology, social identity theory, and emotion to address a really key question in international security, and challenges dominant institutional rationalist accounts of regime type and conflict. And although today I'll be focusing on war, the book manuscript goes beyond this and focuses on hostility and escalation more generally, and I argue has impacts on everything from crisis bargaining to diplomacy. So I'm going to run through this in brief today. I'll be focusing primarily on the theory, including democratic foreign policy, psychological biases, social identity, and emotion. I'll run through the statistical analysis, but I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A. And I'll talk about the case of the Gulf War of 1990-1991. In the larger book project, I'm also including a case study of the Suez Crisis, as well as how non-democracies perceive the threat from Saddam Hussein in the lead up to the Gulf War. I'm also extending the broader project to conduct a series of survey experiments in the US, UK, Brazil, and India. So there's a rich literature on democratic foreign policy, from the democratic peace, right, the empirical finding that democracies tend not to go to war with one another, to the democratic advantage. And democratic autocratic conflict is to a certain extent assumed to be the natural state of thing. And again, one that's often attributed to the weak institutional constraints in these autocratic regimes. But again, this can't account for why democracies are disproportionately the initiators of this conflict. Furthermore, this has trouble explaining why other types of autocratic regimes are not more inclined to target personalists. Because if this were about institutional constraints, or simply that these regimes were fundamentally more threatening, we would expect that all states would be more likely to target them, not just liberal democracies. But this isn't the case. So this leads to my first hypothesis. The characteristic of personalist regimes is independently insufficient to account for the frequency of democratic autocratic conflict. So I focus my sort of first prong of this process on psychological biases, and two in particular. So the first is the vividness effect, which is a common heuristic or cognitive shortcut that predisposes us to perceive information that seems more tangible more heavily. And I have an example that I thought might be appropriate for Vancouver, of, you see a sign about, the threat that a bear might be close is going to read very differently from a bear very closely to you, right? So how we respond to threat is really punctuated by this bias. An attribution probably somewhat more familiar is the tendency to disregard structure and context and place blame on individuals. So personalist leaders, by virtue of their position, tend to be prominently represented. So they're a focal point that is highly vivid and also one that's easy to attribute blame to, and often are, in fact, responsible. But if this were the case, if cognitive biases were sufficient to explain the pattern that I found, then we would expect, again, this to affect all states, because cognitive biases or heuristics, at least how they're generally theorized, apply to all folks. The challenge is that cognition is actually constituted by identity, right? Heuristics and our psychological tendencies are inflected by emotion and memories that have culturally specific meanings. And so we should expect some variation in the manifestation of cognitive biases and heuristics. And, looking back to theorists like Immanuel Kant and moving forward, the sort of history of democracy and liberalism in particular was identified in opposition to tyrannical, in particular monarchical rule. If we move forward, we see sort of ebbs and flows in this, in particular some attraction actually to authoritarianism in the beginning of the 20th century. But after the Second World War, this really hardened, and liberal democracy became sort of commonplace in the parlance of both the academy and policy, and was defined really strongly in opposition to authoritarian rule, especially authoritarian rule attached to individual dictators. So this leads me to my second hypothesis. Democratic social identity augments these certain psychological biases, predisposing them to perceive as personalists as more acute threats. And as I mentioned, emotion is really the connective tissue here, because cognition and emotion are really constitutive parts of the same process. International relations has began to embrace looking and studying emotion more recently, but historically it has really eschewed talking about emotion. But it's often implicit in a lot of our theories that fear is doing the work. But anger and fear actually have distinct effects on decision making. While fear tends to make folks more risk averse, anger tends to make us more risk acceptant. And experimental studies have shown that priming anger actually encourages folks to support more coercive action, be more supportive of aggressive policies. And anger can be thought of as a response to rewards slipping away, but still within reach. So there's almost an aspect of entitlement implicit in anger. And there's certain characteristics of anger that would lead us to believe that this would be a highly salient emotion in these processes. So first, it tends to be focused outward on others. And as I mentioned, if personalist dictators really are these others that reaffirm the democratic self, we might expect this to be primed. Secondly, attribution and anger are closely linked. Studies have demonstrated that attributing blame to an individual is likely to solicit anger. And third, it's more likely to produce a preference for coercive action. This leads to my third hypothesis. Leaders are likely to respond to threats or perceive slights from authoritarian dictators and personalist regimes, predisposing them to favor coercive action. And so I have a little bit of a model here. Unfortunately, cognitive processes aren't linear, so I have a lot of moving arrows getting sort of into the FPA field here. But anger, right, can sort of come before and in the middle and after. So I have these as mutually reinforcing one another: liberal social democratic identity, the vividness effect, and anger. But the basic argument is that when a conflict of interest arises between a liberal democracy and a personalist regime, these mechanisms work together to create a preference for coercive action, especially relative to conflicts with other types of states. I'm really talking about a process that exists inside these leaders' heads, though. So how on earth am I examining this? So there are observable implications we should expect. So first, we should expect a higher rate of conflict between these liberal democracies and personalist regimes, and that the liberal democracies would disproportionately be the initiators. Secondly, that elites in liberal democracies would perceive the personalist behavior to be more threatening and situate that threat in aspects of their social identity, using reference tied to the history of the state and more kind of liberal democratic rhetoric broadly. And that they're likely to respond with anger and a preference for coercive action. So in the larger book project, I do statistical analysis of conflict. I'm in the process of extending survey experiments in the US, UK, Brazil, and India, and case studies of the Suez Crisis and the Gulf War. Today, I'm just going to talk about the statistical analysis in brief and the Gulf War also in brief, but I'm happy to talk about any other aspect of the project. So using a directed dyad dataset, which enables us to identify the initiator and the target, I look at a variety of different types of conflict because, as I argue, this is about hostility broadly, not just specifically war. Also, because war is a relatively rare event, it's very difficult to do any type of quantitative analysis on. So I look at militarized interstate disputes, everything from a threat of use of force up to war. I also look at international crises, which are coded differently, so it's good external validation, as well as interstate wars. I use a variety of different regime measurements because I'm talking about perceptions of state rather than their actual institutional configuration, right? So it is possible that a personalist regime is perceived as such, but is actually not institutionally designed that way. And Iran is always my go-to example. During about 2013 to 2015, there was a lot of conversation regarding the threat from Ahmadinejad, particularly in the US. But in Iran, the supreme leader actually controls foreign policy and the nuclear program. But the threat became tied to him so strongly. So it is possible that there is a mismatch here. Nonetheless, statistical analysis can be useful, especially because of the biases in most of these data sets. They are comprised and often authored by scholars in North America and Western Europe. And so we would actually expect those biases to be appropriate for what I am trying to test. So I use the variety of democracies data set, the Geddes, France, and Right for robustness, the Polity 4, and the Democracy and Dictatorship revisited data set, the Shaboob et al. And I control for kind of the kitchen sink, including capabilities, contiguity, trade, major power status, alliance, and quite a few other aspects. So I have many more tables I'm happy to walk through, but what this table shows is sort of the predictive probability of militarized interstate disputes as the level of liberal democracy increases, right? Because this is about liberalism and this particular type of liberal democracy being predisposed to target the state. So as we move from 0.37 to 0.55 and even further up, which is when you get to around 0.4, I think was at the end of the data set about the coding of Mexico, to 0.87 around the United States or Canada, we see an increase in the effect of the propensity to target personalist regimes. And this holds for wars, crises, and lower level conflicts as well. So I'm going to briefly move on to the case study just to talk a little bit about the Gulf War. I looked at both the Gulf War and the Suez Crisis because this gave some geographic variation. I looked at this from the perspective of the US and the UK to see if I was really just telling a story about the United States to make sure that this was traveling. And I chose the Gulf War in part because this is a bit of a tough case. This was considered to be the end of the Cold War conflict with an aggressive dictator, sort of a test of the New World Order. The whole world came together against the threat of Saddam Hussein. And there's also some within case variation here. And I conducted archival research and talked to elites who were involved in decision making at the US National Archives, the George Bush Presidential Library, and the National Archives in the UK. And so what I'm specifically looking for in this case is first, are democratic elites conceptualizing the threat from Saddam Hussein specifically and how that's affecting their decision to rely on coercive action. So the basic background, because I know some folks may not actually have been alive when this happened. I'm looking around the room. The first Gulf War, and I think this is a really understudied area. I think, hopefully we'll return to this. I think it's very difficult to understand 2003 without actually first looking to 1990, 1991. So Saddam Hussein, or the way the story is ordinarily told, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait after accusing them for months of slant drilling Iraq's economy and sort of infrastructure were in really dire straits after the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. And the US, along with the British, formed an international coalition to push Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. So really just 2 days after the invasion, George Bush was making statements to employees, so as of mid-August, such as our jobs, our way of life, our own freedom, and the freedom of friendly countries around the world would all suffer if control of the world's greatest oil reserves fell into the hands of that one man, Saddam Hussein. And there was cognitive rigidity that often inflected this sort of attachment to Saddam Hussein. And actually, some folks around George H.W. Bush mentioned that they were a little bit concerned that his emphasis on this leader was so strong. There's much in the modern world that is subject to doubts or questions, washed in shades of gray, but not the brutal aggression of Saddam Hussein. It's black and white. The facts are clear, the choice unambiguous. And this sort of framing in terms of Saddam Hussein was really situated in the Munich analogy and other analogies out of the Second World War, both to Mussolini and to Hitler. So all of us share a deep interest born of bitter experience in demonstrating that aggression does not pay. We know and remember the history of the 1930s, and we remember how appeasement whets the appetite of aggressors. This is the White House press secretary. And the United States, and I argue in the larger book manuscript that this was in part a byproduct of normative evolutions that took place in emphasizing that the citizens in autocratic regimes aren't guilty of the same sins of their leader, but are actually deserving of and sometimes in need of protection. And so there's oftentimes rhetorical devices specifically intended to identify the population of the state writ large as not being complicit or not being the target of coalition action. So in a memorandum of a presidential statement, the United States and the rest of the world have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. Our quarrel, the world's quarrel, is with Saddam Hussein. His aggression will not stand. So a challenge in this case is that ultimately the United States didn't go into Iraq and oust Saddam Hussein, right? They pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait. However, the bombing campaign and particular political activities were intended to target the United States. And this actually created some fracturing with the international coalition because the United States at some point, as well as the UK, were seen to have bypassed some of the agreed upon limits of action. But in these states, they did identify the first sort of goal as being the removal of Saddam Hussein. And for the following 10 years, 12 years, really up until 2003, there was a concerted effort to undermine Saddam Hussein through a variety of activities. And actually, because they didn't go in and oust Saddam Hussein, there was a feeling that scholars have identified in Washington that this wasn't really a true political victory. So the attachment was so strong, it continued to animate US and British politics for the years to come, and I argue to some extent culminating in 2003. As Andrew Bacevich said, because of the failure to compel Saddam Hussein to do our will at the end of the Gulf War, Iraq remains a topic not only of historical interest, but also of current concern. Just briefly, there are a number of alternative explanations, which I don't claim are incorrect, but that, again, these are independently insufficient. So first, I took this actually from School of Monterey, lessons from the Naval Postgraduate School, the War in Iraq. And what I found really interesting here is in terms of the sort of benefits, actually the high benefits of the different states, oil is sort of the most common explanation. But this is generally identified as a low benefit in the conversations. And actually, scholars who have looked at this have said that although this was definitely animating conversation, this wasn't always emphasized as the priority. Another explanation is that this New World Order coming out right at the end of the Cold War was an important moment to codify international norms and agreements. But this disregards the fact that Iraq's violations of international law prior to 1990 and the Kuwait invasion were egregious. And these violations were often downplayed by the US administration, even after the Malta summit. So the US tilt toward Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War and a lot of the really horrendous actions of Saddam Hussein in this period were oftentimes overlooked by the administration. Alternatively, that the annexation of Kuwait was an objective threat. So in the Soviet Union, China, and the broader Middle East, they didn't see the invasion in such stark terms. I actually found a great communication between, I believe, Gorbachev and Bush, where where Bush makes an analogy to Hitler, and he says, it's not the same. Very almost confused as to what they're referencing. So it's important to note that there's actually, I think, too little credit given to the US administration and the British and other states at this point in creating a coalition. The jockeying required and the actual payouts needed by these different states were substantial in getting them to agree to join the coalition. This was by no means ideationally sort of a consensus. So just want to conclude, what I find in the case is that the emphasis on Saddam Hussein helps explain not just the US decision for war, but also policy through 2003. And that liberal democracies are between 2 and 4 times more likely to target personalist regimes. And these dynamics are actually driven by politics within democracies themselves. And the implications more broadly is that this shapes how elites respond to and construe threats and colors decision regarding tactics and strategies. And ultimately, this affects not only who we and what we perceive as a threat, but also things like the climate emergency, health pandemic, cybersecurity that might not present the same type of tangibility or be attached to traditional security in the same way, might actually make it challenged to elicit the same type of emotional response conducive to taking concerted action. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Hi.
so much. That was really quite illuminating. I wonder, you want me to use a mic? Are you hearing me all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
How much of this is just inherent in human nature? We all always seem to want to find an individual to blame for any conflict, for any disaster. In that way, overlook perhaps institutional or broader, more complex rationales. How do we distinguish that? Because presumably that's a human reflex.
Yeah.
It's not confined to liberal democracies.
Right.
So I'm just wondering in that level of your analysis, how would you sort of comment on that?
Absolutely. And that's a great question, and one that has been challenging to disentangle. And so one thing that I do in the survey experiments that I didn't present here, that I conducted, I mentioned in the US, the UK, Brazil, and India, is democracies, especially, there's also a geographic component to this that I hinted at. I'm talking about liberal democracies, but I'm talking about a particular tradition and understanding of liberalism. And states that have had their security and identity really constructed by threats identified external to themselves. But if we look at other democracies or other states really and how they identify their security, oftentimes it's defined internally, it's defined by a very different tradition. And so when I tested to see if a description of an institutional configuration have a state as personalist affects folks to the same extent as having kind of a vivid image. What I found was that this wasn't as effective in India and Brazil as it was in the US and the UK. And I attribute that largely to, again, this being rooted in a particular history and understanding of security. But I think there's a lot more research to be done on this because I do think this is absolutely a human tendency. There's also been some really interesting research in psychology, actually doing some experiments in East Asia, testing how responsibility or blame is attributed for a homicide. And they gave kind of a fictional newspaper article. And what they found is compared to this, I think they tested North America and two countries in Western Europe, that actually respondents in East Asia were more likely to identify the causes or the issues as societal or structural, vis-a-vis in North America and Western Europe, where they were like, well, the murder, right? Which again, to me is intuitive. But I think it also gets to some of these things that have long been debated in the psychology research, that most respondents aren't weird, and sort of trying to question my own, at least, underlying biases.
Question. Variance in geography, but also different states and how they interpret liberal democracy.
Yes.
You mentioned in the results that they are 2 to 4 times more
Mhm.
likely to be initiator of conflict. To be able to tell us more about the differences between those countries, which is like 2 times or 4 times, and what are the differences?
Absolutely. So I do drop the US because, of course, this is we would expect this to some extent to be driving the results, and I apologize. So these are so impossible to read, and I apologize. I didn't expect it for so. I won't even try. So I will say between 2 and 4 times likely, rather than actually depending on the inclusion of what states. This is very much driven by North America and Western European democracies, I will say, writ large, with a couple of small exceptions. But it's more contingent on the level of conflict. So if we're looking at militarized interstate disputes, one that escalate to the show of force versus the use of force versus crises versus wars. Again, I apologize. It's cut off. But this actually lays out the wars. And I use Ryder and Stam's Interstate Wars Revisited to look at how they code the initiator, the target. And I have highlighted cases of democracy and personalist regime, in particular cases where liberal democracy initiated against personalist regime. Unfortunately, everything after 82 is missing. But I'm happy to share these cases. But there was also, to some extent, an uptick. And I mentioned this. There's, as you said, there's variation in this kind of understanding if this ideational aspect or aspect of identity is doing some of the work here, then we would expect how liberalism has been understood and norms regarding populations and dictators, how history has been interpreted, also to affect this. So I think there's a question of where we're headed, given the sort of rise of personalist leaders internationally and democratic backsliding writ large. Is this going to make us mutually more insecure? Or what does it say that in these liberal democracies, there's some attraction to these types of leaders?
Yeah, I was just wondering about putting this into some kind of context, because a lot of the wars between 1945 and 1990 were quite different. What was happening after 1990?
Yeah.
So after what Mary Calder called,
Yeah.
But it also seems to me a lot of this personalization talk about liberal democracies, that there was so much opposition amongst the publics within the liberal democracies to these wars, and a lot of personalization on the basis of the leaders. For instance, George W. Bush was simply trying to continue the war of his father that failed to succeed in winning, actually, because his father marched on Baghdad and taken over Iraq. That would have resolved the need to actually go back in 2003. And if you remember, Tony Blair and George W. Bush were pretty religious people in justified
Yes.
modern war in terms of their Christian principles, right?
Okay.
They were good versus evil set values, tropes of views. So I'm wondering if the elite's perceptions are more to do with their elite perceptions rather than any kind of liberal democracy in that sense. It's simply them acting as dictators and so on. The Iraq War was hardly a kind of decision made on them principles.
So I will say I absolutely agree with you on that point. And a lot of this project, I guess, to give some just by way of background, was really born out of my own political sort of, I guess, awakening coming in around 2003, and just the shock at U.S. decision making. And then later, as someone who worked on Iran and seeing our U.S. foreign policy toward Iran at the time as being animated by someone who institutionally didn't seem to really control the levers of power, and trying to figure out this puzzle. But so first I'll say that the religious question is very interesting. And I actually spent several months reading about monodiabolism and the evolution of the church and the devil as sort of an individual entity, as opposed to kind of, and my dissertation committee had to rein me in quite a bit, but I'm still fascinated by this. And I think there's very much something there, right? We can go to the Weber's tradition, or even more recent work in international relations, which is looking at sort of the evolution of the church, and religion is playing this huge role. So I absolutely think this inflects what I'm describing in very important ways. I think in interstate conflicts, there is an ongoing question I have, which is how do leaders balance, to some extent, charismatic authority, right? Something that we know is very important domestically, with not being a target internationally. And I think this is something that regimes are aware of, and we see this, I think, to some extent in China, as well as in other states, how they're actually thinking about, right, how they're perceived internationally versus domestically, and identifying themselves as a target. I do think that the emphasis that, to some extent, Bush and the other folks I look at were really true believers. So one thing that surprised me was when I looked at declassified documents, and I kind of got into the libraries as soon as that was another logic for these cases, was a large tranche of information had been declassified, was how a lot of what they were repeating publicly was very similar to what they were repeating privately, and that they relied on these devices quite frequently, even though I assumed to some extent that this would be racketeering. And I actually conducted some automated sentiment analysis to look at the frequency of different emotions to demonstrate that anger was in fact doing some of the work here. And what I found was that there wasn't actually a substantial difference at all between the public and the private statements. But I think this is something that definitely deserves more attention. No, thank you so much. And I would love to talk more.
All in one, right? Yeah. So if I just keep going. There we go. We're ready for you. I don't know if you need anything else, but there's this one here and back if you need anything.
Okay.
That's it.
All right. Morning, everyone. Thank you again, CDSN for the invite. Today, what I have here, I call it bridging the gap. But if you check the, what's it called? The agenda, it does says factors, sorry. Does says exploring the root causes of the lack of coping capacity in Ontario First Nations. So again, my name is Faith Ezeazolo. I work with Anish Nabek in the capacity of an emergency management coordinator. And I have had the privilege of working with over 39 or more First Nation communities. And much of what I'll be sharing today is from my experience working with them. I don't know if to call it a research, but again, it's, would I say, challenges that First Nations constantly experience trying to, respond to disasters, as well as things that if we do look at deeply would help us to bridge the gap between First Nations, so our communities and our city. So I wanted to start with just a few background. So in Canada, emergencies such as forest fires, we have flood, earthquakes, they occur each year, and their effects and impacts are ever increasing and overwhelming. Indigenous communities across Canada are not exempted from these emergencies, whether natural or man-made. Emergency events are particularly difficult for many remote First Nation communities, as well as those that lack the infrastructure for quick responses. First Nation communities living on reserves are often affected significantly for the following reason, which is we're looking at geographical location, the fact that their communities are quite remote. There is a lack of accessible roads to these communities most of the times. Socioeconomic conditions, again, which includes poverty, health conditions, or even the population being mostly elderly population. And then there's also lack of critical infrastructure, resources, and capacity. So if you've ever been to First Nation communities, you'll find that there is a big gap in terms of disparity between our cities and these communities, either because the structures are not built, we don't have infrastructure, there is no resources, of course. Again, the issues go on and on. I wanted to look at a little statistics just before I get into further discussion. According to Natural Resource Canada, predominantly Indigenous communities account for 48% of the communities evacuated due to wildfires between 1980 to 2001, even though Indigenous communities represent only 5% of Canadian population. And again, looking at ISC, so which is Indigenous Services Canada database, in their report, I think 2021, over the last 13 years, we've had First Nation communities experience more than 1,300 emergencies, leading to more than 58 evacuations, affecting more than 130,000 people. Some of these people are evacuated more than once for different emergencies. And again, this is in clearer terms, more statistics gotten from Indigenous Services database. And then what you're seeing here, it shows emergencies and evacuations. So the number of emergencies is the green and the number of evacuations. And year to year, if you're looking at this, you'll see that we've had an upward movement. So there's no disasters are not reducing. The events that are happening in these communities are not coming down. If anything, we're having more and more cases occur. And then this one is interesting because it shows just, again, maybe that's something I didn't mention initially, but I do work in Ontario. So most of my research is based on the communities within Ontario, not Canada-wide, I guess. But if you look at this data here, the green represents projects that are finalized, completed finalized projects. The black, it shows progress. Sorry. Projects that are in progress that have received funding, so they are ongoing. And then here, eligible but unfunded, that's the gray color, I think. Yeah, projects that are deemed eligible for funding, but again, they are not funded. And then the pink one says projects that have not yet received or have not even been reviewed at all. But if you look at this statistic, look at here and see how poor our number is. Compared to BC, where we have, I'm looking at here, projects that are deemed eligible for funding, but haven't been funded. We have, in terms of Ontario statistics, our number is very, very, very low, very minimal, which shows that either we're not doing something right, or I don't want to believe we're not documenting this, because I feel like this is from Indigenous Services Canada. Most of their funding, most of First Nations or First Nation communities funding comes heavily from them. And the report here is showing that in Ontario, we're lagging behind. And then we also have here, again, this is showing that most of the activities that we are doing or that we're carrying out each year, it's response and recovery. And you have to know that in emergency management, again, preparedness is a big thing. Preparedness is what makes your community able to withstand the effects of any event, be able to respond, be able to, how do I put it? You get what I mean? But in this statistics, what it's showing is we're not doing enough when it comes to preparedness and mitigation. All of our focus is on response, is on response and recovery. Our communities are not recovering. We're not getting prepared. We're not proactive. That's the word. We're not proactive. We're rather reactive. We're waiting for the event to hit before we start to react. So a little bit of introduction here. An effective community emergency preparedness is important to ensure the protection of people, property, the environment, as well as the restoration of community operations. It develops a clear understanding, emergency preparedness helps us to develop a clear understanding, helps our community leaders to develop a clear understanding of their roles and responsibilities throughout emergency management activities. Most importantly, it prepares the community to respond. It prepares the community for response for emergency situations. The question now is, what makes the community ready to respond to the ever-changing number and complexity of human cost and natural disasters posing public health risk? Community preparedness is complex and involves multiple stakeholders and cross-cutting across sectors such as state, local, public health, department and agencies, law enforcement, fire and rescue organization, social service and faith-based organizations, and ordinary citizens from varied communities. So again, emergency management is not something that, I can't take the credit and be like, yes, I will do this. When an event happens, it requires both the individual. So that's basically, I captured every organization that would be involved in a little small event, right from the police, providing law and order, ensuring that, people are following instructions, people are being where they're supposed to be, to charity organizations, non-for-profit organizations, right? Red Cross, individual community members, volunteering, helping and ensuring that people are evacuated or that people know where they're supposed to go when an event happens. Excuse me. To the public health department, again, if there are people injured or people, depending on the kind of event, like we had COVID, in this regard, you would have the public health department heavily involved. But in a case where it's natural disaster, then we'll be looking at those injured or those that probably were impacted by the events. So how does community preparedness work? Community preparedness work when organizational and individual level stakeholders collaborate. Again, just to break it down, it's not something I can do alone. It's not something the government can do alone. It needs collaboration between the communities and everybody involved. And just to draw an example, collaboration was key to the success in Cold War that promoted community preparedness. The Federal Civil Defense Agency, organized by the American President Harry Truman in 1951, also collaborated with the state and local government to prepare US families and communities for nuclear bomb threat. Then the question that remains is, how can we ensure that our communities are evolving, especially for the emergence of new threats each year? And again, we don't have time, but in summary, again, I'm saying that, okay, I need to put my thoughts together. So in summary, community preparedness is the ability of communities to prepare for, withstand and recover from emergencies in the short and long term, both short and long term goal. We want to make sure that we can no longer deny the present reality. New methods of approach to emergency management at the municipal levels are required as climate change is expected to worsen over the next few decades. And then, again, I'm still going on and on about community preparedness. It takes a village. If you've ever worked with our communities, you know that culture is important to them. where I come from, my African culture, we used to say that it takes a village to raise a child. And if you bring that phrase back to, back to indigenous communities, this phrase embodies the whole community interacting for the well-being of safety and health of all. Particularly, we're looking at vulnerable populations such as children. It is also particularly relevant for those of us in public health as we seek to foster communities that are prepared, especially to help the most undeserved and vulnerable and resilient in the face of natural or human-made emergencies. Today, in fact, that village is becoming global. Historically, communities and governments have not worked well, but we have to strive to do better. We must understand that we are unique, that our unique resources, assets, and needs, and how they can best work together to achieve mutual benefits and results. Indigenous communities live in a post-disaster landscape, and disasters overlapping, reoccurring, and getting worse. So again, I talked about how most of our actions and initiative is centered around recovery and response. We're not doing enough during mitigation and during preparedness. So what we have is our communities almost in a stagnant position. Every time an event happens, they haven't healed from the one. So basically they're dealing with trauma upon trauma upon trauma, and it's building and building. And again, when that keeps happening and we're not doing anything on addressing long-term traumas that are sitting within our communities, we're going to have, it becomes quite more difficult, or it becomes harder for our community to recover when any event happens, because this time around, you're not dealing just with an event. When a flood happens, you're not dealing just with a flood event, because the community maybe in the past still have history of maybe drug use that is still pending and hasn't been addressed. And then on top of that, you add flooding or wildfire, then you evacuate them, then you bring them back to the communities with no social plan, or with no plan on recovery, on activities that would get the community to where they were prior to the event. So what you have is just disasters overlapping, reoccurring, and getting worse. And then during COVID, this was, I don't know, is this bold enough? Yeah. But this was just, so I guess what I have here is just a summary of the challenges that First Nation face when an event happens. So we're looking at funding, we're looking at emergency measures, Ontario, there's flooding, there's community disease, residential schools. We have, it's just so many things in one: flooding, fire, housing, blackout, SARS. It's just so many things. And when you're looking at First Nation, or if you're working with First Nation, to just sum it up, funding, because there is no money. I have maybe 30 of my communities that we haven't even touched. And I've been working with this organization for 3 years, and we've only been able to touch 9 in terms of even writing just emergency management plan. You go from the funding challenge, and then you go into training. We don't have sustainable training. We train the youth, but also there's a big gap, because most of, so when you train people, let me use, for example, fire service, you train the community youth to respond to fire, but these events are seasonal. So after the fire season, what happens to this population? There is no job, and of course, they are struggling to be able to adapt to the cities. The qualifications, the indigenous school qualifications and the Canadian school qualifications is not the same. There is just a lack of communication. There's too much gap in between. And then you're looking at suicide. You're looking at opioid use. There's one of my community right now that have declared for the state of emergency since last year, November. This is March. We're not anywhere near even getting to where we have a clear path on what to do. And then the fire season is coming. They've hardly ever finished. They are still struggling with the drug on opioid use, which can also be curtailed. But then there's also security issue, policing. So the state or the government says that they want to do everything for indigenous communities. But the question is, when you look at our cities and you look at our communities, there's so much gap and far disparity in terms of the structures and what works. We cannot achieve what we have in our communities if we're not talking to the community leaders, if we're not talking to the communities. We have to replicate what we have in our cities, in our communities as well, but we have to do that through communication. One of the biggest challenges, most of the time we assume that these First Nations don't know what they are doing. I've been in position when I came on the role, where my funding was coming from ISK, they will say, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. They will list out, every year you tell me what to do. But have you asked these communities what they want? Because believe me, you or not, these people are way, way more capable than you think they are. Their experiences and their educations is undervalued. We think that they don't have it, but they do have it. They know what they're doing. What they need is the funding and the collaboration and the communication. Before we declared for a state of emergency for my community on this, the chief in council refused that we were not going to do that. I had to stay in a meeting, I'm telling you, 2 hours upon 2 hours of meetings daily, explaining to him why they need to declare a state of emergency. And do you know why? Because what they were scared of is the government coming in and taking control. And why is that? It means that there is no clear communication, because everything he kept saying in that meeting is, what's going to happen when we declare? What's going to happen when we declare? Are they going to come in here and bamboozle and take everything? It means that there is a gap. We're not communicating with them. Why are they scared that getting a response or declaring that they're in need will bring about their structures or their systems not being respected? It means that we've been doing something wrong. We're not communicating with them. We're not putting them on the table with us as decision makers. We think we know what they want, but we can actually speak to them and get to understand what they want. I don't want to take much of your time. And then, of course, there's the inadequate recovery planning. We evacuate these communities. We bring them back into the community. The children have been out of school for 3 months. Nobody is talking about, and then we just, we leave them back in their communities. We wash our hands and we're done. Nobody is talking about the fact that these children haven't been in school for 3 months. Nobody is talking about the psychological or mental health that these people are going through. Again, that's what leads to the use of drug. And then there is no policing. Can you imagine what will happen if we take away the presence of police or any security from Toronto, as just this city? Take away the police. What do you think would happen? Crime rates will go high, and that's what is happening. There is no policing. The government doesn't have funding budget to provide security for them. So they become the easier target for drug cartels to, push their drugs in. We have kids as little as 5 years old on drugs. And again, it's appalling. We're not doing enough for recovery. We're not doing enough for response. We're not doing enough for preparedness for our communities. And until we're able to do that, until we're able to do that, we would never, ever be able to measure or compare. And just to conclude, again, every First Nation wants, or again, this was just after we had done the whole COVID, when we were speaking to them, they wanted that, they demand, or I don't know what, okay, I don't want to sound rude, but they want First Nations, they want that every First Nation has a working emergency management plan funding has an emergency management plan and the funding to implement it. We want First Nations to have an emergency management branch of our own to help smaller communities. Example, we're looking at FINERA, just like we have other organization. FINERA is First Nations organization that is dealing with basically First Nations emergency management organizations that is dealing with First Nation communities, but they've also been struggling because most of their funding comes from ISK, and ISK is not providing that funding. Your community provides leadership to aspire. They want each community to provide leadership that others can look and encourage other communities across Canada. They don't want to be regarded that they are not capable. And finally, my hope is that what I'm hoping today is that what I'm sharing with you will help you to move forward, or would help us to move forward in the recovery planning and relationship building. Because if we can't build the relationships, we can't draw on them when we need them. So we need to build those relationships beforehand. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I only have time for maybe a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. That's awesome. I'll give you an idea. So I thought about this too. Is we don't have an emergency management an agency like FEMA or the National Guard in Canada at all. And you're right, it's fragmented and everyone's reactive. I would think about having a FEMA or National Guard type of overarching organization.
But we have EMO.
It's not big. I mean, even Minister Sajjan, they're working on smaller things at the provincial level, but that doesn't mean it'll be better in other provinces too. If you have a overarching and then funnel it way down, then you help. Otherwise, everyone's gonna want their own thing, and you won't get recruiting for it either. You won't get enough people for it. So if you have an overarching thing that can help everybody, then yeah, sorry. Idea, it's not just an idea.
Yeah, but that's also why FINERA, I just mentioned, is just, I can't remember the full phrase, but it's First Nations Emergency Management. It's just circled around. So it's supposed to be an EMO for First Nations. But part of the problems is getting funding for them because, I mean, to have conferences, to volunteer, to be at these communities, again, money is a big thing. Any other questions? Sorry.
Yeah, on your bar graph, if you, could maybe clarify something, there was a category of eligible but unfunded. And it wasn't clear to me whether that meant that, that the project, was deemed eligible, but then, didn't get approved, or was it that it was approved, but there was no money immediately available to fund it?
So eligible but unfunded means that it does so with the funding scheme, they make it when you're applying for funding, they have the preparedness funding, response funding. And if you're going to apply for any project, you want to make sure or can prove that this is for preparedness or let's say for response. So under eligible but unfunded, these are projects that the government have reviewed based on applications. These are eligible too. I mean, it's something that we are entitled to, but there's no money. Or they're still trying to get the money for it.
Go, but we're kind of thinking we'd start from. Sorry about this. Thank you so much, Ms. Ezeazolo.
Thank you.
What I loved about it was that you reminded us that these things don't happen in a vacuum. Right?
No, they don't.
And it's so important to remember that context when people are planning for adaptation and the expectation that these kinds of crises are going to continue. My simple question is what's your sense of why British Columbia and Ontario seem to be so different in terms of the context of the two? Is it because British Columbia, at least perceptually, has more emergencies? My sense is not.
I feel like they've worked more.
They've worked more.
They've worked more. Especially, I don't know, they had a fire season 2 years ago or a year ago, British Columbia. And the response was amazing. It was like team after team, the way it's collaborating. Now, I don't know how many First Nation communities they have in British Columbia, but in Ontario, there's a lot of them. Under Anishinaabeg, we have 39. There's 39 communities that I'm constantly reaching out to. When I do something on one, I have to cut it across to 39 other communities, and that's just me. And then there's Nokiwan Council, there's Matawa Council. It's just a lot of them, and each of them have nothing less than 8 to 9 communities under them. So the number is way larger. Then we haven't figured ourselves out entirely. So when I talked about FINERA, British Columbia has something like that. I can't remember the name, but I was at DEMCON last year, so disaster management conference in Toronto, and I saw some of the British people coming from, and what British Columbia have is what we're trying to replicate with FINERA. But the thing is, when we do that, ISK will lose funding. That would mean most of the funding that we get through ISK will be coming through FINERA, because we want FINERA as a body. It's an emergency management body that addresses all First Nation communities. British Columbia has something like that, and ISK do not want that, because that would mean their relevance would no longer be valid. It's either we're taking almost their position to be able to establish FINERA and have the government give us money to help our communities. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Quick question, Faye. Thanks very much for the presentation. Early on, you mentioned that 48% of the communities evacuated from 1980 and 2021 were Indigenous communities. And that's an interesting number to me because I believe it, I accept it. But what's the proportion of communities that are rural and remote in Canada that are also Indigenous communities, right? And then, so the question I would have is what, or how would you kind of respond to the question of the underlying vulnerabilities of Indigenous communities because of their geographic location? And I think there's two aspects to that. The first is just isolation, further from services, further from responders, more limited infrastructure. But the second would be the way in which a lot of reserve communities were cited specifically in undesirable places, right? And so there's just a really deeply racist, structural vulnerability to flooding and fire in particular with those communities like things.
I know, but then again, this is their village and their community. And believe it or not, my husband will say, if you kept, I'm sorry, I don't want to be racist, but I'm just going to say it a little bit. But he says, if you put a white man in that environment, he'll make a way, he'll find a way to make it work. And what I'm saying is, because we don't live there, we keep acting like the conditions there is unlivable, but it's not. Through our floodplain mapping, our fire mapping, we've been able to, even risk analysis, we've been able to identify that what this community need is just the government to put in money to actually bring them up to speed. We're talking about 21st century. When I was even back home, I come from West Africa, Nigeria, and drinking water wasn't a problem. Clean water, I feel like, is the most basic. And we're coming to Canada. Why do we have different sprinkling system? If when the city was built, we considered them around the same pipe all over First Nations and into our cities, we will not be dealing with issue of clean water. The same way when it comes to preparedness, the things that we do in our cities, we don't do it for them. We leave them because we're not there, they're not relevant. The only time we remember them is when we go to mine the resources, because mining activities are still there. We get money from them all the time. Land use planning, that's when I've been looking at it. I have a community that, apart from the remoteness I'm talking about, you can't visibly, there's no motorable road. So you get to a point, you stop, either you get a chopper to get you in there, or you take a boat through the lakes. And then the ones that have road is one motorable road. So my point is, there's all this vast land space. When the government was initially making that motorable road, why couldn't we extend our hand and make it double roads? Because what happens is, if I get to that road, somebody coming opposite can't go. You'd have to wait, I cross, then you cross. That's not a problem on a normal day because there is no population. But when there's an event, when there's disaster, and you want to evacuate these communities, that poses a lot of challenge. And when we build our cities, that's what we take into account. We do all this hazard and risk analysis. When we do exercises, we want to know how many cars, where they're coming from, this direction, they're coming here, there is chopper. When we do for these communities, we're not doing the same, we're not doing the same thing. We're giving them the bare minimum. Why?
Hi, my name is Claire Parsons. I am a researcher with the Center for International and Defense Policy in Queen's University, Kingston. But today I'm here representing the Conference of Defense Associations Institute, and I'll be talking to you today about reducing the recruitment and retention of the radical far right in the Canadian Armed Forces. Long title, could have shortened it up. You live and you learn. Before I begin today, just because I am a researcher with the Center for International Defense Policy, and we are currently working on a series of grants funded by National Defense, I give the classic academic caveat that nothing I say today is representative of national defense. However, these are my recommendations for national defense. So my project is a qualitative case study of Canadian and American militaries, as well as Canadian, American, and British far-right extremist groups. It will argue that the recruitment and retention of radical far-right extremists can be minimized through the recommendations inspired by the Arbor Report and adjustments to the early recruitment process. I'm choosing to compare the Canadian Armed Forces to its closest allies for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, white supremacy and neo-Nazi movements are international in nature, and Anglo-Saxon nationalism is found most commonly in Britain, the United States, and Canada. Canadian political culture is also highly influenced by our allies, especially our neighbors to the south. There is often a phrase tossed around that when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, and perhaps Canada the sickest. I'd also like to operationalize my definition of the radical far right before we begin. I choose to engage with the Perry and Scrivens definition because I find it the most wide capturing for the movements I'm going to talk about today. And they define it as a devotion to the inequality and hierarchy among racial and ethnic groups with radical means to achieve them. Central values generally include nationalism, xenophobia, racism, exclusionism, and other traditional anti-democratic values. These groups are incredibly dangerous, highly militarized in militias, and have and will continue to act towards mass atrocities that directly harm innocent civilians. Recent reports from CSIS indicate that lone wolf far-right extremist terrorists are the most common radical threat to Canada, more common than perhaps the more sensationalized radical Islamist. According to Public Safety Canada, a great deal of these types of organizations are listed as terrorist entities, including the Aryan Strike Force, Blood and Honor, Proud Boys, The Base, and 3%ers. On my slide here, I've indicated a couple of high process events. On my slide here, I've indicated sorry, I was looking at this like next slide thing that's giving me a preview. I've indicated a few events of particular note. The January 6th insurrection, the Unite the Right rally in Virginia, as well as the trucker convoy in Ottawa these past couple years. So how does this relate to the military? First and foremost, it was found that in between 1990 and 2010, Grunwald et al. Discovered that of the lone wolf cases that they identified of radical far-right extremists, 25.5% had a military background. If we include far-right extremist groups and organized militias, Simi et al. In the same year found that that number could be bumped up to 31%. That is 1/3 of all mass atrocity offenders. We also find that far-right extremists are 4 times as likely as their far-left counterparts to engage in mass violence. Other things to note from Ham and Spy, we see that the demographics of far-right extremists are highly correlated with the most common recruit of the Canadian Armed Forces. They are often white, unemployed, male, single, and from urban environments. This also happens to be, as I mentioned, the largest recruiting pool, as according to National Defense. I lean on the cases of Patrick Jordan Matthews, a combat engineer in the Canadian Armed Forces, who was actively training recruits, who was also actively training neo-Nazi members of the base in order to commit mass atrocities. I also lean on the case of Brandon Cameron and his alleged association with the Atomwaffen neo-Nazi division. Both were active military members. Both had access to military training. But don't just take my word for it and the research that I have found, take their word for it. In my consultation with Stormfront, the largest open access neo-Nazi forum and white nationalist forum online, there are multiple cases where military training and active service members are being deliberately sought out. Some for a right-wing party in Niagara and Southern Ontario, one to engage in military training with veterans so that they don't have to consult media sources related to the military, and even full claims for a white-based racial militia. What's already been done to address these far-right militias? Well, up until the 1990s, the Americans had a zero-tolerance policy for far-right extremists. It was cut when they needed recruits for the Iraq War, but has since been reinstated since the January 6th insurrection, because there was a bolster of anti-far-right extremist policy after the effects on the Capitol. All military personnel, including those in reserve components, have undergone background investigations and are subjected to continuous evaluation by the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense works directly with the FBI in order to ensure that all military members are engaging in appropriate behavior for the title that they hold. The British have taken a different approach, choosing to engage in diverse recruitment standards, implementing quotas, and a series of adjustments to the day-to-day life of military members in order to make military engagement more flexible, as well as more accommodating to the day-to-day lives of the people who work in the Army. The British had a particular case of Column 88, which, for those unfamiliar with the numerology and vernacular of neo-Nazi organizations, is a blood and honor division in which a officer was able to, rather, a far-right extremist was able to get up to the officer level in the British Armed Forces and begin training recruits with propaganda and information from his far-right extremist group. The information was then hidden from the public as investigations went on. And when it was exposed in late 2019, the British Armed Forces had to engage finally with their problem with far-right extremists in order to accommodate now for the cultural change that is happening not only in Britain, but in Canada and the United States. The Canadians are far behind their allies when it comes to addressing racial and ethnic prejudice. The closest thing that we have is the Arbor Report, which is obviously the document that we consult when dealing with the sexual grievances and harassment that the Canadian Armed Forces have engaged in. This brings me to my recommendations based on my work. Again, highly inspired by the Arbor Report, and accents truly how Canada has the opportunity to do both what our American allies are doing and what our British allies are doing. My first recommendation is changing the jurisdiction of hate crimes. What we see here is that there's a lot of really great translatable stuff from the Arbor Report that we can implement now for far-right extremist issue. Civilian courts have jurisdiction over a vast amount of criminal crimes, but in the military, it's different. The military has specific courts to address crimes committed by active service members because of the unique privileges that they have as service members. I argue that giving civilian courts jurisdiction over hate crimes indicates that racial prejudice and neo-Nazi white supremacist and far-right movements is a national issue that's systemic in CAF and not a CAF issue that requires special treatment. Sections 318 to 320 of the Criminal Code are highly specific in terms of hate crimes and also give indications of harassment criteria. We can see that they are engaging with the Canadian Human Rights Act and the harassment criteria that would apply well to the situations that we see in the Canadian Armed Forces. It would address the third highest complaint category in the Canadian Armed Forces, which is race and ethnic bias. It comes right after sexual grievances and is a notable issue for active service members. The brilliance of this kind of recommendation from Arbor is that CAF can still have the administrative capacity to discipline as it sees fit. Rank, active status, whether or not there is a discharge, that still remains under the jurisdiction of the Canadian Armed Forces. But it ensures that the rule of law in the Canadian legal system is applied broadly to all Canadian citizens, no matter whether they're an active service member or not. Getting a little more specific with the military, I'll talk to you now about the recruitment process. This also comes from the Arbor Report and is supported by the external monitor, Jocelyn Thierin. And I want to talk to you now about the benefits of a process called irregular enrollment. For those unfamiliar with the term irregular enrollment, it is the ability for the Canadian Armed Forces to release a recruit that it does not believe meets the status of service. However, it would also give a recruit the ability to leave recruitment processes, including basic training, at any time they see fit, if they choose that this is not the pathway that they thought it originally would be. Giving CAF the ability to adjudicate whether or not recruits not only meet the physical standards for their position, but also the ethical standards, allows them to personalize the basic training process and focus more on the leadership and ethics that CAF desperately needs in their ethos stated of trusted to serve. Now, the Canadian Armed Forces is facing a recruitment crisis. I don't deny that. Bill Blair, just a couple weeks ago, talked about the importance of ensuring that there are service members ready should Canada need it. But recruiting members who do not meet the standard of the ethos directly jeopardize our retention of military members who are quality in terms of their ethics and characteristics. Group cohesion is not the goal of the far-right extremist. In fact, it puts other recruits in danger. The Americans have a continual evaluation process and a period that invested intelligence to inform their forces of what to look for in their fellow members. As well, Canada could implement the same ideas as the Canadian Armed Forces Indigenous Entry Program and give everyone more opportunities to not only assess the institution, but the recruit. It is a flexible process that prioritizes fitness to serve. Connected directly to the intelligence process, I recommend that Canadians could learn from their American allies. I do not like to give the Americans credit, but I give credit where credit is due, including improving their intelligence on extremist groups, numerology, symbols, and dog whistles. Continual evaluation of members, which is focused on ongoing analysis of counter-terror work, is extremely important in identifying far-right extremists who are trying to remain undercover in the service. The Americans even had a full stand down after January 6th, where the forces were educated on what the signs of far-right extremist propaganda was and how to avoid engaging with it online. The Americans have also engaged in periodic scraping of their active members to ensure that they are compliant with these orders. Fitch et al. And the Ministerial Advisory Board recommended that investigations remain confidential should someone be caught, because of the sensitivity of the issue at hand. If charged, then the information will be released publicly. If, of course, recommendation number 1 is implemented and civilian courts have jurisdiction. There is a valid critique here that these investigations should be made public as soon as they begin so that they act as a deterrent. But what we've learned from the British case is that if we do not have all the facts prior, and we choose to engage only in the disclosure of small pieces of information, that the public has less faith in the institution at hand. Engaging in high-level, diligent intelligence work, we know that we can provide proper summaries to augment trust in the institution, as well as analyze how radicalized someone has become. Cooperation with allies is also highly important during this time. I highly recommend engagement with the Five Eyes allies, as they are Anglo-Saxon in their nationality, which would improve our ability to understand what far-right movements look like around the world. Far-right movements are centralized online, and propaganda is perpetuated from small towns in the United Kingdom to middles of cities in Australia. It does not matter one's nationality. Radicalization can happen anywhere at any time. My last recommendation is adding momentum to culture change. The Canadian Armed Forces, to their credit, has prioritized to making sure that the sexual grievances cases that they are seeing are addressed properly. And the truth is that a safe and diverse workforce improves the culture of a workplace. And at its core, the Canadian Armed Forces is a workplace. The majority of these recommendations are prompted by a crisis concerning sexual harassment. This is a gender-based lens that the Canadian Armed Forces is engaging in, and further intersectionality and including race and ethnicity and pushing forward those attributes into their changes will directly improve life for service members. Trusted to Serve is a great start, cracking military myths around the warrior-based identity and disarming the strongman. It says that the military is not a place to express collective grievances for people around the world or a legitimate place for sanctioned violence without cause. It is instead a document that states that the Canadian Armed Service member is devoting oneself to loyalty to its people and to serve Canada before self. Looking more into the day-to-day effect of the current lifestyles of the military life and its rigidness, as we see through the British case, it would mean that Canadian service members could have more flexible days, more abilities to network, and catered performance reviews that would take into account the current status of their lifestyles and identities. A diverse workforce is operationally effective, and its team cohesion is better, and its workforce is healthier, directly applying the values of strong, secure, engaged. Look, obviously, we're facing a recruitment crisis, but solving our cultural crisis will increase recruitment of all Canadians, not just the ones that we know how to recruit. I want to finish with a quote from Louise Arbour. The value of loyalty, especially to one's comrades and the institution, appears to frequently come into conflict with the value of integrity, as evidenced by the blatant and long-standing problematic behaviors that have gone unreported and unaddressed over multiple decades. We can choose to address one crisis and leave the other. That's an option that we have. But this isn't just about creating a large force and meeting the numbers required for the Canadian Armed Forces. This is about creating an effective, impactful, and moral force that understands the values and the weight of the job with which they are trusted. If we've seen anything over the course of our history, it's that a large force will always be outclassed by a quality one. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for that expose. You referred, of course, to the Defense Minister's emphasis on the recruitment crisis. I think the shortfall is like 10,000 for the regular forces. And if I heard correctly, because it was on a recent CBC News program, that as part of the response, he's dropped the requirement for certain entry tests.
Yes.
And it struck me that, and I don't know the nature of those tests, but you would think that that would be an ideal vehicle to screen out far right predispositions among recruits. So can you just add any insights to that? I mean, is that a danger when you drop those kinds of, I mean, you talked about the probationary period, my hopes that maybe you could detect later, but you think if you could screen out at the beginning, it would be all the better.
Absolutely, I can. I'm thrilled you asked this question because I had to cut that portion of my research for this final project. So I get to talk about things that I was interested in that I didn't get to talk about. So the Canadian Armed Forces engages with a personality test that is meant to adjudicate whether or not a Canadian Armed Forces potential member can handle certain tasks. It's most commonly used to associate, whether someone can be on a submarine for a long period of time, or do they have the proper calm, cool, collected attitude required to fly a fighter jet. But the characteristics of this personality test of sorts is not really based in much psychological science. It's much more along the lines of a best guess. The problem that you find with these personality tests is that if you continually ask a service member about their political affiliations, and far-right extremists are inherently political in nature, you run the risk of then screening out recruits based on certain political attitudes when the Canadian Armed Forces is meant to be apolitical in its entirety. Once they are a recruit and in basic training, that's when you can look for those characteristics and signs. But prior to that event, they are a private civilian. And asking about political affiliation before recruitment blurs the line of security and political discrimination. So it's a gray line. I haven't been able to deep dive into it on the way I would love to. But yeah.
Political affiliation, obviously.
Mhm.
Presumably talking about attitudes, if you had important white supremacy, that would be a warning.
Absolutely. I will say, far right extremists are briefed on how to pass those tests from former veterans. So it is highly unlikely that a radical recruit will come in and say, you know, on a personality test, you know, I'm really interested in Hitler. It's highly unlikely. It's an operation actually titled Run Silent, Run Deep. That's a blood and honor trademark right there, where those tests are exposed to recruits from former members. They say, here's how to pass them. The basic training recruitment process, they're looking for those more subtle factors that far right extremists can't control, including basic discrimination against fellow members in their unit during basic training, rather than a more formalized analyzation of them and their characteristics. Please.
You talk about radicalization in the far right, but what about de-radicalization? Does the Canadian Armed Forces have some sort of policy on, like, the state house, so de-radicalized people could get into these? There's a de-radicalization could be extremely left as well.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah. De-radical. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Program like this, I brought in the military to help the people about this.
Well, the Americans have the stand down, which I would highly recommend for the Canadian Armed Forces. That's, however, a highly formalized event. And anybody in the Canadian Armed Forces will tell you that death by PowerPoint is not the way to touch somebody. The best way to do it is actually through leadership. So the de-radicalization process is less formalized. There is no formal program to de-radicalize. That's why I highly argue that leadership needs to be engaged on what to look for in terms of far right extremism, so that they can pull their subordinates aside and say, hey, I'm seeing this pattern with you. There is some isolation happening with you. That's highly common as far right extremists get drawn into online forums. This is a phenomenon in which leadership is the touch point. When I talk about personalization and catering, with Trusted to Serve and basic training, having leaders know the life circumstances of a recruit is essential to their de-radicalization. So it's really a process where we are putting faith in our leadership to engage in that process and have a touch point with those recruits before it's too late and there's actions that cannot be undone. Any more questions? No? Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, hold on. I just want to set that somewhere. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm going to set a timer too, so I can sort of keep track. All right, thanks, Hannah.
That's what he brought. Yeah, sorry. I had
Hey, good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Sonja Maul-Wilson, graduate student at the University of Victoria at the School of Public Administration. And before I begin, I would first like to acknowledge that the study that I conducted, as well as making this presentation, took place on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, as well as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, on whose territory they have a historical relationship, which continues to this day. Today, I will be speaking to you about my presentation, which seeks to ultimately expand our view of Canadian military families and the vast diversity that they represent. Okay. So for this presentation, I will first situate the problem by providing context that Claire spoke to as well, in which the CAF finds itself. And then from there, I'll speak to why my research could help in addressing this issue. And then I'll define the traditional military family, provide some numbers on the misalignment with the families that do exist, and then proceed into a definition of the non-traditional military families. And finally, I will transition to a personal connection and then provide some preliminary findings of the study that I conducted. Okay, so the context. So you don't have to look very far to find that the Canadian Armed Forces is in a severe personnel crisis. Claire spoke to that as well. We did have a presentation with the Navy yesterday, and the numbers are about 10% short, but I think in the Navy it's even more. I think he spoke to 20% short in the Navy. And so that looks like that issue will be ever more challenged as, for example, with the Navy again, more ships come online, more requirement for personnel. And the fact that there are not enough personnel to train new people exasperates this issue even further. So my research, like I said, it seeks to help address this issue, and I'm investigating military families. I see in the literature that the diversity of military families is not well understood, and as a result, the diversity of military families may not be well supported. So my argument is that the Canadian Armed Forces needs to be welcoming to all sorts of family constructs, period, because one, it's the right thing to do, but then two, it's an especially important endeavor in a personnel crisis. Basically, the CAF doesn't have the luxury to be restricting itself to one very specific type of family in its recruiting as well as its retention of personnel. Okay, so what family construct am I talking about today? It's the traditional military family. And so that is the service member who is a man, so man in the military, partnered with a woman who is a civilian and their children, if they have any. And so based on that definition, my study defines the traditional military spouse as civilian woman married to or common law with a man in the military. And so understanding what the traditional military family is matters, because researchers argue that the CAF, like many other Western militaries, often operates under the assumption that it can tap into the traditional military family constructs. And so the traditional family, what it's all based on, is adult male who is in paid employment, providing the family's economic basis, partnered with a woman who is primarily responsible for the care of husband, household, and children, and she may or may not have additional economic contributions to the family. And so in the context of the Canadian Armed Forces, military families are generally assumed to work like this. And so assumptions may include things like when a military member is away, the domestic work that needs to take place will nonetheless happen. And that is generally assumed to take place by a military spouse. So that's already assuming that there is one. And so the military spouses, another assumption is that, oh, sorry, am I in the wrong spot? Okay, sorry, I thought you were indicating I was in the wrong spot. Anyway, so military spouses, another assumption is that they will not prioritize their careers. They will give up any employment when there is a posting, and oftentimes they'll take the bulk of the work when there is a posting that takes place and it's unpaid. And so what the literature shows is that these traditional military spouses, so civilian woman married to a man in the military, generally face employment challenges. So they're underemployed or unemployed. That's not the case for everybody, but there's plenty of literature that shows that they often struggle with this. And there's a number of employment programs in Canada to try to alleviate that. And that's because there's just so much additional labor pushed onto the family in order to ensure that the military member is successful and that ultimately CAF operations are successful. But the demographics of military families in Canada don't really support these traditional assumptions. The traditional family among military families is frankly less common these days, and it's no longer the default. It's just not in the numbers. So if you take a look at the graph on your right, one of the key features of a traditional military family is having a spouse. And the rate of personnel, so regular force personnel that are married or common law in the Canadian Armed Forces, has been on a relatively steady decline since 1997, all the way for this graph until 2022. So it was 75%, and now it's down to 55% of personnel who are married. And so if you take that 55% and then you slice it with all of the other ways that the Canadian Armed Forces has been transforming over the same period, such as having more women serve, it reduces that number further, or having two members of the forces serving together, service couples, reduces it further, as well as other examples such as same-sex couples. So who are these other military families that we speak of? So non-traditional military families. And some researchers offer examples of these families. Alluded to it before, but we're talking about our service members who are single and have perhaps children themselves, so single parents that are serving, service couples, same-sex couples, and those military families that have a military spouse who is a man. Previous researchers didn't go as far as defining these non-traditional military families. So for the purposes of my study, they're defined as any military family configuration that does not conform to that of the traditional military family as previously defined. And for the purpose of my study, therefore, a non-traditional military spouse is a person who's married, common law with a military member, but they do not fit into the same sort of constructs as a traditional military spouse. So knowing that many military families in Canada are not captured among traditional military constructs, I was very keen to learn about non-traditional military families. And so my research centers them, and specifically it's the military spouses who are men. Researchers implore that more studies needed to be taking place on military families because of the changing demographics. As well, there's a lot of consensus among researchers that these military spouses who are men are not represented in studies. And further, Corey et al. 2021 implores that understanding the differences between the genders of military spouses is important. And Lufkin advocated for more research on military spouses who are men as a way to help all of the military families with their programs. Okay, so my study has entered the chat, and it is exploring the experiences of non-traditional military spouses concerning the impact that the Canadian Armed Forces has on their careers and their lives. And it seeks to challenge the assumptions made about Canadian military families. And it does so by centering military spouses identifying as men. And in centering them, it allows us to take a look at these non-traditional military families and spouses. It shines a light on them, bringing awareness to their presence as unique from the perceptions of who military spouses are. It identifies their unique experiences and ideally can assist in understanding them, their needs, and again, the diversity of the entire spectrum of military families. My study used a mixed methods approach. I took a look at some secondary data that I got from the Department of National Defense, very hard-won data that I got. I was very excited. And I augmented that information with a number of interviews with military spouses who identify as men. But before I move on, I feel like I should mention I have a personal connection to this research as well. Many of these folks in this room know that I served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 15 years, and I spent a significant period of that time away from my family on operations as well as training. So for example, in this photo, I was back, I had been away after returning from maternity leave with this little gaffer. And at that time, in 2017, the photos at the same time, starting then, I spent like 6 to 8 months away per year for 3 years. And so my spouse, Braden, newly minted lawyer at the time, took care of our young child. He took care of all of our domestic requirements and our finances in my absence. So here are some preliminary findings of my study, but I will note that this thesis is not completed yet. And the final report, confirmed findings, will be available later this year. So some of the themes that I found. So familiarity with the CAF among these particular participants, career sacrifices, question mark, and shared ownership of domestic duties. All right, so from the secondary data that I utilized, I found 50% of the participants, the military spouses who identified as men in this collection of data, were veterans. And that was significantly higher than those that are the traditional military spouses who identified that they were 8% veterans. And so in the interviews that I conducted with personnel to understand this further, the participants demonstrated a very strong connection with the Canadian Armed Forces, with either past service or current service. And that was all of the participants except one. And that participant lived in a military community growing up, was very well aware of the challenges among military families, and had tried to join the military before he had met his spouse and became a military spouse himself, and just couldn't because of health issues. So even the sole participant of this study had some really great awareness of the Canadian Armed Forces. And so in all of this, I find a dichotomy here with these military spouses and the CAF. So as I had said at the beginning, there's not a lot of research on these folks. So there's not a great understanding. And in the CAF too, that's part of the problem, is that there's this view that military families are just this one way. And so that demonstrates that the CAF doesn't really know these folks, but yet they really know the CAF. So I thought that was just such an interesting contrast in that particular finding. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is I write opposite experience of traditional military spouses just to be a little bit provocative. It's not opposite, but it does demonstrate that in the literature, the traditional military spouses are often like shocked by the pressures that are put on them because they're not as well versed in what the Canadian Armed Forces does, like this entire beast and how it works. That's not always the case, but the military spouses in the study, they really know what it is and what pressures it puts on. So I thought that was a very interesting finding too, that they're just having such different experiences. And that's not to say that the military spouses who are men in this study or at large are not affected by the shock waves and sort of the upheaval that is the Canadian Armed Forces on families. But I just wonder if perhaps they are less challenged by it because they might know a little bit more about it. And that is really not to say that the traditional military spouses is not meant to be disparaging, that they don't know. It's just that perhaps they don't have the same sort of foundational experiences going into it, that it makes it just harder. It just makes it a more friction like experience. Another thing could just be society. So women are sort of expected to take on more of these domestic roles and responsibilities. And perhaps these military spouses who are men, maybe they don't have to. Maybe their careers are more important in societal views. So there's a number of things that could be someone else's study. So on that note of career sacrifices, there's a huge question mark here because in the secondary data that I looked at, the military spouses who are men demonstrated very, very mixed results. Some of them had expressed that they had some major career sacrifices, some had none. And those two camps were very equal. For the traditional military spouses, most of them had said that, oh yeah, perfect. Most of them had said that the career sacrifices that they had made were great. So that's already a difference between these subjects. And then when I dug into it with the interviews, there was a very strong theme with the military spouses who are men, and they had most all of them had experienced very little career sacrifice. And so many of those had said, in fact, they thought that being a military spouse had helped their career in a number of ways. And there are so many examples when people would talk about having taken a very intentional decision to slow their career down or perhaps even hurt their career in order to prioritize their partner who's serving in the military, make sure they could do what they needed to do. And in the end, it turned out that was a benefit for them. They didn't think it would be, and it was. And so that goes back to another big contrast with traditional military spouses who face many career challenges, not all of them, but many, enough so that there are, tons of research on this, as well as spousal support programs. And the last theme, so shared ownership of domestic tasks. The secondary data from the Department of National Defense didn't talk about this, but this came strongly through the interviews. And so what I noticed is that these military spouses who are men took so much ownership over the domestic tasks. It was really felt that we're all in this together. It's like a 50-50%. We all need to contribute here. It's everyone's responsibility here. And there was an exception. And that was with the military spouses who I have identified as having children who are fathers. Many had said that, in fact, their spouse, when it comes to childcare, did take on more of that. It could be that in this particular circumstance, these participants, their spouses had maternity leave just very recently. So perhaps that could be dug into more. Or maybe it's back to society that it's expected that women have a greater responsibility over children. But again, going back to the literature, this was a massive contrast with the traditional military spouses, who often are the person who is mainly responsible for domestic tasks. And it's so much so that their careers are affected. I do also note that this sort of sharing of domestic tasks is more in line with Canadian societal values. I looked up a recent Stats Canada article, which said that more and more men are really seeing that it is a 50-50 split. We're all in this together. So there is a shifting dynamic in Canada with that taking place. And I wonder if perhaps these military spouses who are men are just tapping into a sentiment that is Canadian society, which I think is good. So the conclusion, to sum up all of this, the Canadian military family demographics, they just don't support the views that exist in the Canadian Armed Forces about what military families are and who comprises them. More non-traditional military families exist. I was part of one. And military spouses who are men just have completely different experiences as their role as a military spouse. For example, it seems to me that they have a very vast source of knowledge of the Canadian Armed Forces. Perhaps that could be tapped into in some way. Their careers may not suffer to the same extent as the traditional military spouses. Perhaps that could be a model. And even more, the domestic sharing seems to be quite prevalent, and perhaps that's also part of it as well. I just hit 20 minutes. I'm so happy. So that is the end of the presentation, and I just want to also say just another heartfelt thank you to the Canadian Defence and Security Network. I very much appreciate this opportunity. Okay.
What are the takeaways for personnel management, do you think? How should decision-making change aside from not perceiving all families as being the standard model?
Yeah, so I think it does. I think everyone can hear me. I think it really does take just like understanding that the roles at home matter. And I can give you a good example. So when I was in the Canadian Armed Forces, there was many times where, you know, it was 5 o'clock. I have to go pick up my child because if I don't at 5:30, the clock starts running. It's $1 a minute. And if you don't pick up, you know, in a certain amount of time, they will call the police on you actually. So they'll charge you. And then if you hit a certain threshold, they'll call you police. I mention that because at that time, my spouse would be going to court for his career. And that's also not really a place where you can say, oh, actually, I'm done. So I say that because I think I had some tension with some supervisors when I said, actually, it's only me. I have to leave. And I think that that speaks to what the Canadian Armed Forces sees as like the member and the operation is all important, even if it's training. Like we can't possibly let a person leave to go pick up their child so the police aren't called because this is so important. So I think it is sort of a mindset to realize that families are very important. It's the operation and training is not the only thing that exists. Yes.
Thanks, Sonja.
Paul.
I'm wondering, you're being good at it this way.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Okay.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Sonja. I really appreciate it. Something I want to just point out, it came up in Madison and Claire's presentation as well, is I love a research project that kind of creates a whole that is the next research project, right? And it really sets you up. And by looking at military spouses who are men, you've teed up the lesbian spouses in the Canadian Armed Forces project, right? Like that's the one demographic that doesn't get captured in terms of the traditional military family and then the alternative non-traditional families you're looking at.
Yeah.
But I'm curious by this big kind of number that you gave between 97 and 2022.
Yeah.
The decline in married or common law forces members from around 75 to around 55%, I think is what you said. And that's really interesting because you framed your findings around non-traditional family structures, which is very valid and relevant, and I understand that. But it also seems like there's a shift away from family structures and the rise of single or unmarried, unpartnered forces members.
Yeah.
And that now there's an ambiguity there. Some of those people might have children, and so they will have family structures with these single parents. There's a bit of a gray area there.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about what you might say as a potential point of contact between your and Claire presentations around the potential recruitment value for far right and potentially other organizations of single people in the forces disproportionately, right? Especially if they're male, what that might mean in terms of a more potentially accepting, recruitment pool for those kinds of movements seeking to operate within the forces. If you have a lot more single, less tethered, less grounded potential members of the forces. Does that make sense?
It does. So I think I'll just hit in two parts. So one, I would say that I've benefited from this particular viewpoint. So now I'll explain. But so single folks, oftentimes because they are single military members, it's sort of treated like their sort of personal aspirations and their families don't really matter that much. Like, okay, you want to go home for Christmas to Ontario from Victoria, but you're single, you're not with your kids and your family. So maybe you can be the one on duty for the entire Christmas period, going on to a ship for all of this period. So one, I would say it does take like opening it up to see that everyone's situation matters. Everyone's sort of personal connection outside of the military matters. Like if they've got their chosen family, they might want to see them sometimes, even if they are unattached. But I'm not sure how that could sort of relate to Claire's research, because maybe I think that the logic could be, maybe they're more susceptible to different organizations, but I don't think so. I think that is, I think they're independent. I wouldn't say that people that are unattached are a little bit more susceptible to these types of organizations. I've got tons of friends that just want to, every time just go see their parents, so their situations matter as well. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Yeah, just a data issue. Service couples, is that becoming a more frequent combination with non-traditional family structure? Do you have any sort of figures on that?
I don't, and I apologize. I don't know why this is like, some of the formatting is weird here, so I apologize for that. But So yes, service couples are more common. They're becoming more common. And there are some really interesting stats to say that, so a service member like myself, when I was in, as a woman, I'm way more likely to find my partner in the military than a man would. They're more likely to find a civilian. And that's probably because of like similar sort of, you understand, what the person is going through. And there's just less women, right? So there's less women, there's more men, you're sort of in this environment together, you're finding a lot of commonality. And from the a man's point of view, there's less women. So you've got to find, your love interest elsewhere. But I don't have a stat on the exact numbers of service couples, but I know that it is rising, and you can expect with bringing in more LGBTQ personnel, they're probably going to have more service couples together as well. And as well as more women being in the military, there's going to be more service couples. And that's what the Canadian Armed Forces is trying to do, have more women and more diversity in terms of sexual orientation. Okay, Ken, yes.
Talk about these sort of traditional nuclear families, no
Yes.
longer the traditional nuclear family. But I'm wondering about if there's any studies on the rate of domestic violence within military families, because I mean, I'm interested in kind of dysfunctionality of the family in that sense. Whether military families tend to be more dysfunctional because of this very curious arrangement. Someone has to be away for large periods of time, this creates maybe tension within the family. Wondering if there's a higher rate of the domestic violence from a gender perspective.
So yes, I didn't read a lot of those, but I know that that is the case, that because of this sort of militarized environment, domestic violence rates are higher in militaries, and that's not just the Canadian military. But I'll point out a really interesting study that was in the States where they focused on women who abuse their military spouse who is a man, and the high rates of that. And the rates were exponentially higher than rates of American women at large abusing their partners. So there's definitely something there to dig into.
Okay, really, really great presentation. I found it super interesting. I wonder, when you talked about interviewing male spouses and how being a military spouse has actually benefited their career, was that more in terms of like career progression, that they got to a further point in the end than they thought they would, or was it more like quality of life of like slowing down and benefited?
So many different examples, but one was this man who was in the Canadian Public Service. His career was kind of stagnant at that point. He was happy making a good amount of money, but things weren't really progressing. And then his wife, who's in the military, had this opportunity to move the family from Ottawa to Montreal. And he was like, that's not going to work. How am I going to manage my team? Because this was before COVID. So he was going to effectively lose that position. It wasn't really acceptable at that time in Ottawa to be a director managing a team of 20 at that point. So he thought, and he's an example of somebody who made an intentional decision to slow the career down. He was like, okay, we'll move and I will quit and go back to school. And because he wanted to do something while he was in Montreal and he just couldn't keep his job. So that schooling program that he took gave him all of these different contexts. And in the end, he got poached by a startup and made like twice as much money as he was making in Montreal after his program. And then from there, they were moved to, I think it was Brussels. Yeah, Brussels. And he was able to keep that role because of of COVID's modernization of that, but still keep that role and make a much higher rate of pay. So he attributed that to the stability of the military. He knew taking this program was still a bit of a risk, but he could always fall back on his wife's steady paycheck as well as the benefits. And the posting was not ideal for his situation, he thought, but in the end, it ended up turning around completely, and it was a winning moment for him.
One last one.
Okay.
It just occurred to me that, when Will was asking about possible convergence between, Claire and Sonja's, research areas, that, Claire also had a point that she didn't get a chance to convey.
Oh, I was just going to say concerning, single particularly younger members of the military who end up radicalized, is kind of associated with feelings of loneliness. Men with romantic partners, children, more thriving social lives are far less likely to be radicalized. So just to associate with Sonia's work, which is so spectacular. Allowing single military members, allowing younger military members to still foster their relationships outside of their career is highly beneficial to their, it's highly beneficial to the less likelihood of radicalization.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much to our morning panel. And sorry for eating a little bit into lunch, which is ready outside. So help yourselves, and then we're planning to start promptly at 1:30 for our afternoon panel. So thanks so much everyone for a great evening.
The association. Back in the day, I got chapter. Super cool. Yeah.